as we begin all of our shiurim, that we dedicate the learning to the return of the captives. I think we're down to 3, Baruch Hashem. We started out at 200 and something, and we have 3 more to go. So we are waiting for that day. Also, we hope that the zchut of our learning goes to the pitzuim, to the soldiers who have been wounded on the field of battle. We wish them a refuat hanefesh, refuat haguf, for the safety of our chayalim. We know that this is a lull. We hope that the lull continues and that they remain protected and safe. And the safety for Achenu B'nai Israel, who are endangered really all over the world, and for an ultimate victory over Amalek. And biyachad ninatzeach, that we can maintain the unity that we have felt as we face the challenges ahead of us. Amen. So we left off last time talking about Rabbi Eliezer's opinion in the Mishnah that we recite the Shema until the end of the first watch, which we discovered was 3 hours after night begins, after when the stars are visible. We're going to finish this sugya, this discussion tonight, and it will take us hopefully to some very interesting places, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. As a general principle, the Gemara prefers it when things are presented simple and clear. When things are stated that could have been stated more simply or more clearly, the Gemara assumes that there's a reason for that, and mostly, if it is not presented simply and clearly, it assumes there is something additional that the Gemara wants to teach us. And we discussed this when we talked about how the Mishnah set out when an individual can start saying the Shema in the nighttime, rather than say, B'tzeit HaKochavim, at the time when the stars come out, where everybody agrees that that is the time. But they said it is the time that the Kohanim go to mikvah so that they can be tahor to eat their truma. Now, that has nothing to do with the topic of hand, but the Mishnah had a hidden agenda, or not so hidden agenda, that it wanted to spend time reinforcing the practice of Kohanim going to become tahor during the time of the Beit HaMikdash, so when the Beit HaMikdash would be rebuilt, we would not forget. And the Gemara continues this approach when it talks about the ending time, or at least one of the opinions of the ending time of saying Shema. It quotes Rabbi Eliezer, who says that we can say it until the end of the first watch, which begs the question, the same question, okay, when exactly is that, and why aren't you being clear and simple? So in this case, Rabbi Eliezer doesn't want to remind us about temple practices. He wants to tell us about something metaphysically. He wants to tell us that heaven and earth are connected. Not only are they connected, but there are parallel existences in Shemayim and Aretz. And through that, he tells us how the Kadosh Baruch Hu wants to relate to us as individuals, and how the Kadosh Baruch Hu wants to relate to us as a nation. And this parallel design between Shemayim and Aretz is by design. And we brought a number of Mishnayot last time that said specifically that. And we talked about several examples last time. We talked about in the Kol Nidre, we say B'yeshiva shel Mala and B'yeshiva shel Mata, which means that there's a heavenly court as that parallels the earthly court. And we brought the Tomer Dvorah, which says that there are 2 sets of Yud Gimel Midot, of ways that we should comport ourselves. One is for us, and that's the Hashem Kel Rechum V'Chanun. And there's another one that the Kadosh Baruch Hu has to guide his behavior. And we said that came from 2 psukim from Micha. And so there's an interesting question that comes out of this discussion, which is, did the Ribono Shel Olam
alter his world so that he could relate to us? Or did he create our world so we could relate to him? And to the surprise of nobody here, there's a machloket, right? There are different opinions, and there are three different opinions. One is yes, one is no, one is both. So Rashi says that the surprise is that the Kadosh Baruch Hu created divisions of the nighttime here on earth. And he says that if it were the other way around, we wouldn't need signs or markers, which we will get to in just a minute, to tell us about the different divisions of the night in Shemayim. The Tiferet Yisrael, who is Rabbi Yisrael Lifshitz, who's an important 19th century German rabbi, and he has a famous commentary on the Mishnah. He says that the Chiddush for us is that not that there are divisions here on earth, but that there are divisions in Shemayim. That God also parallels these things, and we are told that the reason he did that is so that we would know when to daven and how to daven to him. We will get to that. The third idea, which is by the Maharal of Prague, he wrote a perush on the aggaditah, and he calls it Magid Ta'alumot. Ta'alumot are mysteries or enigmas. So he confirms that what we've been talking about, that the study of aggaditah is mostly the study of revealing mysteries and enigmas. This is his famous perush, and he says the chiddush here is that there are meaningful divisions during the night at all, whether it's in Shemayim or here. Although it's a shiur for a different time, and I know I say that a lot, but we will get to that, right? But it's worth thinking about why we as a people are so tied up with time and the exactness of time. Everything needs to be done at a specific time. We have an expression that goes avar zmano batel korbano, that when the time for a korban is gone, we can no longer bring that korban. Kohelet tells us famously, L'chol zman ve'et u'l'chol chafetz tachat hashamayim, that for everything in this world there is a specific time. Right? And so we see here that the night, rather than just be 12 hours from sunset or from stars coming out until dawn, there are specific times associated with each of these divisions. So maybe we'll explore that at greater depth, but not tonight. So if you recall, we had said that there were two models in terms of divisions of the night. We said there was the Greek military model that had 3 watches, and we said there was the Roman military model that had 4 watches during the night. And as a halachic practical matter, the question was, if it's the end of the first watch under the Greek model, you have 4 hours to complete the Shema, and if it's the Roman model of 4 watches, then you only have 3 hours. I can do that simple math. Actually, that's not true. I wrote it down. But in order for us to choose, even though the Gemara tells us that Rabbi Eliezer held that there were 3 watches during the night, he can't base it on the Greek model. He needs to have a Jewish source to back it up. So he brings a pasuk from the Navi Yirmiyah, Jeremiah, to prove that the night has 3 sections to it. Now this is the pasuk he brings. V'ata tinavei aleihem et kol hadvarim ha'ele v'amart aleihem. God is speaking to Yirmiyah, and he said, you should prophesize these things and speak to them. Hashem mimaron yish'ag umimon kadsho yitain kolo. And God will roar, or he roars from on high in Shemayim, and he bellows from his holy dwelling, and it goes sha'og yish'ag, roaring aloud over the earthly abode, the Beit HaMikdash, and uttering sounds like grape treaders against the dwellers on earth. Right? So just as an interesting historical aside that will mean nothing to anybody who's not American, but there is a very famous song called the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And it starts out, he is trampled through the storehouse where the grapes of wrath are stored. And it comes from this pasuk, that it talks about revenge, and that was the revenge that the North was going to have on the South. But it comes from this particular pasuk talking about the grapes of wrath that he's going to take against, we'll see who. So based on this pasuk, the Gemara says the following. This is source 2. Ditanya. Ditanya means we're going to quote a braita. A braita is a Mishnah that didn't make the grade. When Yehuda HaNasi collected all of the Mishnayot to put into the Mishnah, he had more than he could use. So he only put in some and he left out others. That doesn't mean that they aren't holy. It doesn't mean they aren't important. So the authors of the Gemara who had these Mishnahs who didn't make the grade still quote from them, and they're called braita. Now, if you want to say I'm quoting a Mishnah, you say Ditanya, and if you say Ditanan, and if you're quoting a braita, you say Ditanya. So here we're going to quote a braita. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Rabbi Eliezer says, Shalosh mishmarot have halayla. There are 3 watches during the night. V'al kol mishmar mishmar, and on each or over each one of these watches, Yoshev HaKadosh Baruch Hu v'shoeg ka'ari, right? And he roars like a lion. Shene'emar, Hashem mimaron yish'ag, mima'on kacho yiten kolo sha'o sha'ag al navehu. So he quotes part of this pasuk, and he said because the word sha'ag, to roar, right, shin aleph gimel, shows up 3 times, he knows that the night is divided into 3 parts, right? So Rebbe Eliezer is telling us not only that the night is divided into 3, but also that for some reason or another, God roars during each of these watches. So I want to pause here for a minute and talk about methodology. When the Gemara cites a pasuk, we can't just gloss over it and say, okay, I guess that proves it, let's move on. Usually when you learn Gemara, when it says shene'emar, which is going to quote a pasuk, it usually means skip, right? People say, oh, okay, I get it. I guess that does that. But we need to ask ourselves, especially when we're learning aggaditah, why did he choose this pasuk? There are 23,145 psukim in the Tanakh. And I am sure that many of them also have 3 words that are the same in it. For example, we say, right, from Yeshaya, V'kara ze el ze v'yamar, you've heard this before. What are the next 3 words? Kadosh, 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 Hashem Tzebaot, Melo Kol Haaretz Kavodo. So why didn't he pick this one? In Yechezkel, it says, Ava, 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 Ashmimena Gamzot Lo Haya Ad Bo Asher Lo Hamishpatu Nitativ. Ruin, 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 I will make it. That also shall not be until comes whose right it is, and I will give it to them. Why not use either of these? Right? Now the Amoraim of the Gemara, those are the rabbis during the Gemara, they knew the entire Tanakh by heart. And they also assume that the reader, meaning us, also knows the Tanakh by heart. And if you notice, we read the full pasuk, and then we read what Rabbi Eliezer said. And Rabbi Eliezer doesn't give us the full pasuk, nor does he tell us where it comes from. He also doesn't give us the context where the pasuk is found. So we have to assume that what he presented is just a hint, and what we need to do is unpack it and to try and figure out why this pasuk, what is this context, how does it prove it, and what is the underlying message he's trying to teach us. So the context of this pasuk is from the Navi Yirmiyahu. It's from the prophet Jeremiah. And the prophecy is that the Beit HaMikdash will be destroyed because of our sins. But mostly, it is about the vengeance he will seek against the nations who attacked and exiled us, or will attack and exile us. And in this way, he says that if the Kadosh Baruch Hu is going to punish Klal Yisrael, how can he let the attackers off scot-free? So what is the connection exactly between this pasuk and our discussion about watches of the night? Right? The context of our pasuk, the one that the Gemara quotes, is about galut. Right? It talks about the reason for our punishment and the punishment for our oppressors. Now, one of the common themes that we see is galut is portrayed as nighttime. Right? It's seen as a dark, bitter time. So I brought 3 sources to prove that, but I want to give you an idea of how Chazal thought about the galut. The first one is from Bereshit Rabbah, which is a medrash on Sefer Bereshit, and this comes from the first perek, and it's talking about Vayerev Vayiboker, right? There's morning and there's evening, and it's bringing another idea. When it says Devar Acher, it means that it's brought a lot of ideas before that, but they're not relevant to what we're discussing, so I only took this. Kol Shman Shehashukcha de Galuta Tali al Yisrael, any time, or as long as the darkness of exile hangs over Israel, it is Lila. We consider that period of time nighttime. Kevan shenigale or hagula, when we have the light of the geula, of redemption, we're going to consider that time day. So the rabbis had an opinion that when you talk about nighttime, symbolically, you're talking about the galut. If you look at Shir Shirim, the Yalkut Shimoni, which is another medrash on Shir Shirim, it says Devar Acher, Beleilot, when it says Beleilot at night, Bigaluyot. You're talking about a time of galuyot. Another idea, Beleilot, Bechashachat Giluyot. It is in the darkness of the galut. Devar Acher Balayla Shehagalut Domeh Lelayla. When it says nighttime, it is because the galut is compared to nighttime. Galut Chashecha Hi. Galut is darkness. And then it goes on to talk about the darkness. When you talk to us about a specific galut, they're talking about galut Yavan. We'll leave that for another time when we talk about Hanukkah. One more is from another medrash, Kevan shecharav Beit HaMikdash. Ever since the Beit HaMikdash has been destroyed, Nichnasu Yisrael Balayla, we have entered at night during our galut, not into the Beit HaMikdash, but the Beit HaKnesset ulevatei Midrash. We come to the Beit Knesset and to the Beit Midrash because of the galut. V'hayu tzoakim ubochim balayla bakol gadol. And we would shout and cry out at night in a loud, pleading voice. So here, Rebbe Eliezer is not just telling us about time, or even telling us about the Shema. He's telling us in a very cryptic way about galut.
he's telling us how Galut is divided into three pieces, and he's telling us about how the Kadosh Baruch Hu relates to each of these sections of Galut, which we're going to have to talk about. So the Navi, right, Yirmiyah, says that the Kadosh Baruch Hu roars like a lion. So he roars like a lion in each of these three aspects of Galut, which means exactly what? So one idea is that he roars like a lion to the fact that he had to destroy his Beit HaMikdash, his home in this world, and to exile us out of our land. If we think about this kind of roar, it is a roar of pain and regret. He also roars like a lion seeking vengeance of our oppressors. This is the roar of a king who's asserting his power. It's an image to instill fear to all who hear it. And if you look at source 7, the Navi Amos tells us, Aryeh sha'ag umi lo yira. When a lion roars, who is not going to be afraid? Now, for the South Africans among us, where lions roam the streets of all the cities and everywhere, this is not a surprise. If you've gone on safari and you have heard a lion roar, and they were close enough to actually see the lion, it is terrifying, right? Maybe the third roar is a sign of hope and a sign of Geulah. If you look at the end of the pasuk in source 7, it says, Adonai Hashem diber, when God speaks, mi lo yinabe. When you hear his roar, who is not going to prophesy? So what are they going to prophesize in this case? They're going to speak about the prophecy of the ultimate redemption that the Kadosh Baruch Hu has promised, right? In this way, as we said, the Galut is not just felt down here, but also in Shemayim by the Kadosh Baruch Hu. And this roar is loud and painful and angry and comforting. Now, there's an interesting idea I came across by this Rabbi Shabtai Bass, who was a 17th century rabbi from Prague and later Amsterdam. He wrote a sefer called the Siftei Chachamim. And when you learn about this eschatology, right, this idea of angelology of angels, we say that the Kadosh Baruch Hu is always surrounded by angels, and they are singing his praises. That's where we get the idea of Kadosh, 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 Hashem Tzivakot. Just like the angels sing God's praises, we want to sing God's praises as well. And Rav Bass points out that Rabbi Eliezer tells us, V'al kol mishmar u'mishmar, which is a strange way to say it. He doesn't say during every single mishmar. He says v'al, and on top of every mishmar and mishmar. And he says that the roars of the Kadosh Baruch Hu are so loud that they drowned out the malachim, which means that the Kadosh Baruch Hu drowns out the malachim who are singing his praises because he does not want to hear them as long as the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed and we are in Galut and our enemies go unpunished. And this idea goes nicely with the idea that we brought about Rabbi Eliezer from last time, where he explains that there are watches in heaven like they are on earth, military watches, that the military protects us here and the Kadosh Baruch Hu protects us from Shemayim. So when we spoke about the story of Rabban Gamliel, I don't know if you remember, and about his sons who came home from the wedding, we mentioned that with that aggaditah, it is often important to know not just what is said and what it means, but who said it, and why it was important for the Gemara to cite the individual who said it. So in this light, who is Rabbi Eliezer?
who brings this aggaditah. And what is his context? Right? Why would he be talking about this? So this is Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkanus, and he lived in the generation that witnessed the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash and the retreat from Yerushalayim to Yavne. He was one of the main students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who established the yeshiva, and it was his job in this world of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, along with the other Rabbanim, to rebuild the Jewish world. So imagine for a moment the pain that he felt and the things that he lived through, and his desire not only to see the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash, but the punishment of those who inflicted this tragedy upon us. He understood the pain that he and all Klal Yisrael were feeling in the shattered Jewish world, and he understood that there was a parallel in Shemayim. Rabbi Eliezer was also one of the teachers of Rabbi Akiva, who also had this burning desire to bring back the Jewish world as we knew it. Okay. So we all know that this idea of a lion roaring is a metaphor. The Borei Olam doesn't really roar like a lion, but like all metaphors, it gives us insight and a feeling as to what is happening in Shemayim 3 times during the week. And we suggested the nature of this roaring, right? We said one out of pain and the other out of anger and the other out of hope or comfort. But Rebbe Eliezer says that if you want to recognize both when the mishmarot, the watches change, right, when we go from one to another, and how to recognize their character, there are 3 very cryptic signs. So he says, Siman Lidavar, a marker, a symbol for this. This is the changing of the mishmarot and what they mean. Mishmar Rishonah, during the first watch, Chamor Noar, that the donkey brays. Shniya, Klavim Tzoakim, during the second, dogs bark or shout. Shlishit, in the third watch, which is the one closest to the morning. Tinok Yonek Mishadei Imo, a baby suckles his mother. And Isha Misaperet Im Ba'ala, and the wife speaks to the husband. What does that mean? Right? I mean, think about it. Anybody want to take a guess in terms of what these 3 signs could possibly mean? We will get to, hopefully, the when, right? When do you hear these things? And we need to find out now, or figure out what these signs means. Now, there's one approach that says, don't read too much into it, that they are what they are. It's like what Sigmund Freud was reportedly said, he never said it, was sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. And that means early in the evening, meaning at the beginning of the night, donkeys typically bray. In the middle of the night, dogs tend to bark. And just before dawn in the morning, babies nurse and wives and husbands wake up and plan their day. But if that's what he wanted to say, why would he be so cryptic? I mean, he's obviously trying to tell us and teach us something more. Right? First, he tells us there are 3 heavenly mishmarot, and Hashem roars during each one. And if you want to understand what this roaring is all about and what these watches are all about metaphorically, you have to look at these things that happen in our world, because they are hints and insights into what's going on in Shemayim. So that doesn't sound like he's just giving us markers that you can hear or pay attention to every day. So in other words, Rebbe Eliezer here is saying that the spiritual nature of these times, these time periods in Shemayim, are reflected
by a braying donkey, a barking dog, and a nursing mother, and at the same time a wife speaking to her husband. So looking at it this way, there are a number of things we have to figure out. Are these distinct periods of time, meaning that each one is separate? Are they related to each other? Is there a progression to go from donkey to dog to couple? Are they somehow tied to the lion's roar, right? Why specifically these signs? Because I will tell you, the first two are animals, the last one is humans, and the one that you would expect for the morning would have been, come on, help me out here, the rooster. Right, and we say every day, we say a bracha that the Kadosh Baruch Hu gave the ability of the rooster to differentiate between night and darkness. And I would think that that would be the perfect symbol to use. No, you don't think so?
It's over then. That's probably end of the night.
We will get to that. That is perfect, because he's going to ask the question, do these symbols, do they happen at the beginning of the Mishmar, at the end of the Mishmar, in the middle of the Mishmar? It's not clear. And we have to ask, why particularly in this order? So you can imagine, over the millennia, our rabbis have tried to unpack these images and uncover hidden meanings behind them. In fact, and I guarantee you this, if we wanted to spend the next 6 months, and that would mean we would not have a siyum anytime soon, and we wanted to really plumb the depths of the different approaches and to explain this brief statement, not a problem. So what I want to do is just bring you a few. One says that it reinforces this idea of galut, and that since he was talking about galut before, he's saying, I'm going to show you how these three occurrences, I was going to say three animals, proved that, right? So the donkey, according to this opinion, is that there are different stages in galut. And the first stage when we enter into galut is when the nations, the Ummot Olam, begin to enslave us, and they burden us and oppress us, and they do this to deepen our sense of galut. Certainly the image of the galut Mitzrayim is that, when they increased our burden. And they said that the donkey, who represents carrying a burden, is the image for that. The next one, they say, is the dog. And the dog not just barks, but it bites. And this is where the galut puts us into physical danger, and the dog attacks us. There is, and we talked about this last time in Baba Kama, I believe, it says when the Malach HaMavet comes into a city, the dog barks. So this is the dangerous time. The third one says that the couple who's speaking, that we become subjugated. Now, I'm just repeating. We become subjugating like a husband subjugates his wife, right? Think not about a Jewish household, but think about a household where women are treated as chattel and are forced to be controlled, right? And that's the third stage, if you will, of galut. So the baby nursing is a sign of hope, is a sign of redemption in the future. So when we get to the third stage of galut, we have both oppression and hope at the same time, right? And to tie it to the roaring, that no matter throughout the pain that we feel in galut, whatever the stage, the Kadosh Baruch Hu roars over the trouble that we are in. There's, yeah.
This may be taking way off. The donkey's in the field. The dog is near the home. and the third is actually in a herd.
Oh, okay.
And I'm wondering if
Wait,
there's also,
let me just repeat it.
yeah,
That interesting idea that you're talking about something that literally gets closer and closer to home. That the donkey is in the field, the dog is in the courtyard, and the husband and wife are in bed, safe in the house. Okay, so what does that mean?
well, there's also parallels, and maybe with the first temple, the second temple, and the coming third temple.
There is absolutely that idea. That is the first temple, the second temple, and the third temple. There are ideas like it stands for different areas of Shachris, Mincha, and Maariv, right? Because we do a lot of things in threes, but that's a very interesting idea. There's another idea that the dog represents protection, that it is the time when we are asleep, and it's the dog that protects us. There's an interesting thing that happens that we say that dogs in our tradition get praised, high praise, because they didn't bark when we left Egypt, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and really, who cares? Recently, I guess not so recently, we went on a tour of Egypt with this Rav Joshua Berman, which was brilliant. And he pointed out that what that means is that the animal that protected the Nile, according to Egyptian mythology, was the jackal, which is essentially a dog. And when Moshe Rabbeinu went to retrieve the bones of Yosef, the dogs didn't stop him, and they didn't bark. But if you look at it the other way, the job of a dog is protection. So one image is that dogs protect us. So what does the chamor represent? And that talks about that these three images, and we've now broken away really to understand the mishmarot in heaven, but it reflects our lives here on earth. And the chamor represents, as it will in many cases, work. And it is descriptive of our lives. So the beginning of our nighttime is the time that we come home from work, and we are still involved with the chamor. We are decompressing, we're still preoccupied with the day, we're still transitioning to being home. The second, as we said, is the time of the dog, when we're asleep, and the Kadosh Baruch Hu, the dog protects us. And the third image is the family waking up, right? Morning starts again. The image of a baby nursing is one of learning Torah, that we're getting up to learn Torah. And the image of a wife conversing with her husband, we have throughout Navi, the image of our relationship to the Kadosh Baruch Hu is a wife to her husband, the husband being the Kadosh Baruch Hu. And if the wife is conversing with the Kadosh Baruch Hu, it means that we are beginning to face our day with tefillah. There's another idea that it has to do with learning. One of the interesting things is that in all of these three images, it doesn't say the donkey, the dog, and the wife and husband. It says the donkey braying, the dog barking, and the husband and wife conversing. Everybody's awake and alert. And so in this idea, there is a Mishnah in Pirkei Avot that says one of the characteristics in terms of learning is that we should minimize the time we spend sleeping and dedicate that time to learning, right? So that the nighttime becomes not a time of watching Netflix and YouTube, but a time of coming out to shiur and learning, like we all are doing right now. We're going to get to, not today, an aggaditah about David HaMelech who would wake up at midnight to learn. We'll have to figure out what that's talking about. But that says that these 3 sections of the night says that you should steal from each of these sections and dedicate them to learning and to Torah. There's, of course, I'm not going to leave this particular area until we get some Kabbalistic insight, and that is that the night, these 3 animals, represents the 3 aspects of our spiritual being, which is the nefesh, our physicality, our breathing that keeps us alive, our ruach, and our neshama, which in this case refers to our intellect. So how does that work? At the beginning of the night, as we have said a few times, that we return from physical labor or whatever worldly occupations we have, and this is dedicated to our physical needs. The second part of the night is when we are asleep, and as we said, this is our ruach, and the dog watches over us as a protector. And in the morning, refreshed and protected, this is the metaphor for our seichel, for our neshama, that we reconnect to the Kadosh Baruch Hu. And we say that in our Berachot, that we modeh ani lefanecha shechazarta li nishmati, that you have replaced my neshama and it is now reconnected in a conscious way to you. Okay, questions, comments, ideas? I know it's a lot. So on a practical level, we said that Rabbi Eliezer said that these symbols, these signs, mark the different mishmarot. So the question that you have to ask is, when do these things happen? Do they mark the beginning? Do they mark the middle? Or do they mark the end? Right? So here's what I mean. So if you look at source 9, my kachashiv Rebbe Eliezer, what is it that he's telling us in terms of when these things happen? Itchilat mishmarot kechashiv, if he says that each of these happen at the beginning of the mishmar, which is what Josh had suggested, and he raised the question in terms of babies nursing and people arising is really at the end. Tchilat mishmara rishona simona lamali. I don't really need the first sign. What does that mean? Let's finish and then I'll say what we mean. Isof mishmara kechashiv, if he's talking about the end of the mishmar, sof mishmara acharona siman lamali. I don't need the morning siman. Yamamahu, it's the day. Okay, so what is the basic problem? The basic problem is we have 3 mishmarot during the night. We know when the first one begins, and we know when the last one ends. So we know the first one begins at Tzeta Kochabim, when you have 3 stars. So if I know for sure when it begins, then what do I need the donkey braying to tell me that it started? On the other hand, if I say, okay, it's to mark the end of the mishmar, then I have a problem on the other side. Because as Josh said, that happens at dawn when people are waking up. So I don't need to know about the women nursing, the ladies nursing, or the conversation between husband and wife, because I know when that is exactly. So I don't need one of the 3 depending on how I calculate it, right? So the Gemara says, okay, here's the solution. Ella, chashiv sof mishmara harishona, the donkey brays at the end of the first watch, utchila mishmara acharona, rishona, utchilat mishmara acharona, and they wake up at the beginning, at the last mishmar, ve'emtzait de'emtzait, and the dog barks in the middle of the middle one. Ve'ibai sema kula sof mishmar chashiv. We'll get to that in a minute. So the Gemara's suggested solution is really, I don't know, how,
The middle one is.
yeah, how happy are you? So they said, well, we don't have to look at it as beginning, which would make sense, or end, which makes sense. We're going to say that the first one comes at the end, okay? So then you say, and the last one comes at the beginning, and the middle one comes at the middle. And you sit there and you say, we started this year talking about how the Gemara doesn't like complicated things. They like easy things. They like things that are simple and clear. This is not simple or clear. So the Gemara comes back and says, Sof kulhu, I'm going to tell you that in reality, that all of the signs happen at the end of each mishmar, which means that we know that night begins at 3 stars. We know that it ends when the donkey brays. We know that it begins when the donkey brays, right? And it ends when the dog barks, okay? And we know that it ends in the morning when people get up in the morning, essentially. So now you're going to ask me, but you just told me that can't be because we have a sign by looking outside that we know that's when day breaks. Okay. So in order to rescue Rabbi Eliezer, they say, okay, so here is a case where you need to have it at the end. And that is when you live in a basement apartment in Manhattan and you get no light and you have no windows and you can't tell if it is day or night. So in that case, people will get up naturally, and if you hear a husband and wife speaking,
What about when the night starts?
when the night starts, we know it's 3 stars.
Yeah, you've got no windows.
Yeah, but you're outside. You're coming home. Don't kill the messenger. I'm just reading here. So the question is, why should we care? Right? I mean, what difference does it make if we know when the watches are? Or if we know when the transition comes from one to another? We have a tefillah that we say at specific times, like on Shabbat Mincha, and when we say the Yud Gimel Midot, and that is Va'ani tefillati lecha Adonai et ratzon. I hope that my prayer comes at a propitious time, which means there are times when our prayers are effective, and there are times when our prayers are not accepted as fully. I mean, when there is in Nusach Sfard, right, in Eidot HaMizrach, they say Ashamnu every day. We say Ashamnu every day. In Nusach Ashkenaz, they don't. When we say Ashamnu, Bagadnu, Gazalnu on Yom Kippur, it certainly carries more weight than when we say it every day. So there are times when prayers are more effective. And we know that during the night is a time that's propitious for prayer, and different things that we ask the Kadosh Baruch Hu for happen at different times at the night. And by knowing which are accepted when, I mean, the famous part that we have is when we say slichot. Now, slichot is supposed to be said right after chatzot, right after the middle of the night, and that is thought to be the most propitious time to beseech the Kadosh Baruch Hu. There's also something called tikkun halayla. There's a tikkun Rachel and a tikkun Leah, which is beseeching the Kadosh Baruch Hu over the Chorban Beit HaMikdash, asking him to restore the Beit HaMikdash. And that happens also at midnight. So knowing when the dog barks that this is the time to get up and to say Tikkun Laila is very important to know. I don't know if I ever told you this story, but they tell a story about the Opterav, the Ohev Yisrael. And all of the Hasidic or Rebbeim would travel from place to place, and he was in the Ukraine, and it was midnight, and he was davening the Tikkun Leil Chatzot, and the innkeeper came and knocked on his door, and he said, "Is everything all right?" He said, "Yeah, why?" He said, "Because I hear crying and screaming. Everything's okay?" He says, "Yeah, I'm just davening Tikkun Leil Chatzot." He said, "Well, could you stop? Because the guests are complaining that you're making too much noise." So he said, I'm praying for the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash. Don't you want that?" So he goes, "Let me ask my wife." So he comes back and he says, "No, my wife says you should stop." And he says, "Well, I'm davening for Mashiach to come. We have this terrible, galut that we're in. Don't you want to be, to go back to Eretz Yisrael and to come out of the galut?" He says, "You have a good point. Let me come right back." So he comes back, and he says, "No, my wife said, please stop." And in pleading, the Ohev Yisrael said, "Look, the Cossacks are bothering us, are attacking us. Don't you want that to stop?" He said, "Okay, let me come back." And he comes back, he said, "No, I spoke to my wife, and my wife said, if you're going to daven for the Kadosh Baruch Hu to come and take the Cossacks to Eretz Yisrael. We have an inn here. We just bought a cow. We have a new garage, a new barn door. So that you can daven for, but we're going to stay here." Anyway, okay, so I think what we'll do is we'll stop here, because to start the next piece is going to take us a little while to kind of puzzle out.